Rick didn't just raise his voice at me that night, he raised it in front of my mother, and she stayed silent. That silence cut deeper than any insult he threw. In that moment, I realized something brutal. The man who claimed he ran the house wasn't just trying to control me, he was training her to disappear. My name is Morgan Higgins, and that was the night I finally understood what I'd been avoiding for years. When someone steamrolls the people you love, eventually they'll come for you too, and Rick did. He just had no idea who he was coming for. The morning I arrived in Alaska, the cold hit me first sharp, unfiltered. Nothing like the soft winters back in DQC. Snow reached my ankles before I even made it up the porch steps, and every breath I took scraped against my lungs. The cabin sat tucked between sheets of ice-heavy pines, the kind of place that would have felt peaceful under different circumstances. I knocked once before letting myself in. The blast of heated air should have been comforting, but instead it felt claustrophobic, like walking into a room where an argument had just ended. My mother's voice floated from the hallway, thin and stretched, and then he appeared. Rick Calder filled the doorway with a posture that said he expected the world to shrink for him. Broad shoulders, controlled movements, a stare that slid over me as if scanning for weaknesses. Before I could set my bags down, he crossed to the thermostat and twisted it lower, muttering about wasting fuel. Then he eyed the boots I had just untied and nudged them aside with his foot. Unimpressed, he didn't ask how my trip was. He didn't ask how my mother was doing today. He pointed at the small collection of devices peeking from my backpack and said they were unnecessary clutter, then repositioned the coat rack like I had offended the order of the entire house by hanging my jacket wrong. Only after rearranging everything I'd touched did he look at me directly and declare that his rules were what kept this place running. His tone wasn't loud, but it carried a kind of ownership that settled over the room like a heavy blanket. My mother hovered behind him, trying to mask the exhaustion pulling at her eyes. She offered a smile meant to smooth the edges, but it wavered, caught somewhere between welcome and apology, standing there in the doorway, boots still wet, coat half-zipped. I felt the realization settle deep in my chest, whatever I thought I was returning home to. This wasn't it, and whatever this man believed he controlled, I was about to learn the hard way what it meant to live under his roof. Working from my mother's kitchen felt like trying to breathe through a pinhole. The space was small, the walls old, and every sound traveled farther than it should have. I kept my eyes on my screen, careful with every keystroke, attempting to blend into the quiet routine of the house. Rick moved around with a kind of restless authority, glancing at me whenever he thought I wouldn't notice, as if monitoring how much of the day I devoted to what he called staring at a machine. That afternoon, the cold seeped deep enough into the floor that my feet ached. I slipped off my heavy coat and draped it near the counter to let it dry. I barely turned away before hearing him rummage where he had no business being. When I spun back, he was already pulling the secure device from my pocket, as casually as someone fishing loose change out of a couch cushion. He shook it, held it against his ear, and studied it like he expected to uncover some hidden misdeed. Then he made his declaration he'd keep it until he felt I respected the order of his home. The way he said it wasn't a request. It was an ultimatum from someone who believed control was the same thing as leadership. I felt a sharp pull in my chest, but I forced myself to stay still. That device was not designed to spend a single second outside my reach. It held a direct line into systems he couldn't begin to imagine. Systems that didn't tolerate mishandling or interruption, but revealing any of that wasn't an option, as if the day needed more pressure. The local station broke into programming with an emergency update. A massive winter storm had shifted course, predicted to isolate entire neighborhoods for up to 72 hours. Rick muttered something about stocking firewood, but my mind was already racing, calculating risks far beyond the weather. A storm outside, another inside, and one I couldn't speak about tightening behind both. The weight of all three settled on my shoulders at once. By the next morning, the sky had dissolved into a pale, uneven sheet of white, the kind that made distance and depth feel uncertain. I opened my laptop to catch a brief window of connection before the storm disrupted everything. The moment my system synced, A coded message blinked across the screen, an encrypted alert routed straight from Elmendorf. Unusual cyber activity detected in Northern Network. The words tightened something low in my stomach. Two threats were converging: the storm barreling toward us, and a digital disturbance that had the potential to ripple through essential infrastructure. Neither was abstract, neither could be ignored, and both were closing in faster than expected. I barely had a second to process before I sensed Rick behind me again, arms crossed, posture rigid, eyes fixed on my screen. Instead of asking what I was working on, he made another comment about people who hid behind computers instead of dealing with real problems. His tone carried that familiar mix of dismissal and superiority that he seemed to breathe like oxygen. I shut my laptop and turned just enough to catch a reflection in the darkened screen. Outside, through drifting flakes, Nolan stood on his porch watching the house. Not nosy intent, a kind of attention that came from training, not gossip. Later, when I stepped outside to toss a bag of trash, he moved closer, snow crunching under his boots. His voice was low, gravelly, but unwavering as he pointed out how quickly I'd shielded my screen earlier. Too quick, too precise, too familiar to anyone who'd spent years in uniform. He didn't pry. He didn't congratulate himself for noticing. He simply gave a small nod, subtle, respectful, and unmistakably deliberate. Not a question, not an accusation, a promise. He knew I wasn't what I appeared to be, and he'd seen enough to decide he was on my side long before I'd ever ask. Nights in Alaska have a way of swallowing sound, which is why the faint creak that woke me felt so deliberate. It wasn't the groan of settling wood or the push of freezing wind. It was measured steps, slow, careful, intrusive. By morning, when the storm's gray light seeped into the room, the confirmation waited on my laptop the moment I opened it. Unauthorized access attempt. 02:14 a.m. Someone had been inside my machine. In the kitchen, Rick stood at the counter pouring coffee with the casual confidence of a man convinced he'd done something noble. He claimed he'd only checked my laptop to be sure I wasn't hiding anything under his roof. The pride in his voice made it clear he expected gratitude. All I felt was the cold jolt of what his snooping had triggered. My phone buzzed with an alert from the classified network, device lost location, anomaly detected. The system was trying to locate the secure unit he'd taken from my coat. My mother appeared at the bottom of the stairs, rubbing her hands together for warmth, worry etched into the lines around her eyes. She urged me not to escalate things, insisting Rick only wanted to keep the household steady with the storm approaching. She had no idea how dangerous his behavior truly was. Before I could respond, the weather report cut in with an emergency update. The storm had shifted and was now expected to slam directly into town. Supplies would run out fast, and power could evaporate within hours. The pressure closed in from every direction, and Rick, oblivious to all of it, accused me of tampering with systems I knew better than he could ever imagine. That was the moment I felt something inside me harden. He'd crossed a line that couldn't be undone. By nightfall, the storm arrived in full force. Snow hammered the windows so hard the glass trembled. Flickering lights signaled the grid slipping under the weight of the wind. I was at the table, trying to hold the weakening connection long enough to stabilize the network, when a red alert blazed across my screen. Critical! Confirm integrity of Node 6. If I failed to respond, automated failsafes could disrupt essential systems across the region. Behind me! Rick hovered again, arms crossed, breathing down my neck like a guard convinced he was protecting his kingdom. When the stolen device vibrated sharply in the drawer beside him, I shifted into immediate action, breaking the careful facade I'd maintained since arriving. That single quick movement was enough to ignite him. He charged across the room, shouting that he'd caught me accessing something illegal. My mother pressed her hand to her mouth in terror, unable to process the storm outside and the chaos inside happening all at once. The lights died with a sharp pop. Darkness swallowed us, except for the cold blue glow of my laptop, the only thing illuminating my face. Urgent, last call flashed across the screen. Then the back door blew open, letting in a burst of frigid air. Nolan stood there, snow crusted on his hood, eyes fixed on me with quiet understanding. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The alert escalated to its final stage, system threat escalating. Acknowledge now! Rick shouted that he wouldn't let me ruin his home. But I knew the truth. Silence was no longer an option. The storm clawed at the roof so violently, it sounded like metal being scraped open. Inside, Rick planted himself in the middle of the living room, chest out, sleeves pushed up like he was leading a tactical briefing rather than a neighborhood gathering. He clapped loudly to command attention and announced that we were holding a storm prep meeting and that he'd be the one directing it. No one challenged him. People were too tired, too cold, and too dependent on the nearest warm room. 2 volunteer rescue workers sat near the window, shaking off snow. A reservist leaned against the wall, arms crossed. 3 elderly neighbors took seats close to the heater. Nolan positioned himself in a corner, quiet but sharply observant. Rick sent me to pour coffee, trying to frame me as part of the support staff to boost his own authority. As I set mugs on the counter, the drawer near the table rattled violently. The device inside vibrated so hard the handle shook. Gasps rippled through the room. Rick shot me a scowl and barked a question about why I kept bringing noisy electronics into his house. He didn't know the sound. That insistent pulse was a federal-level emergency alert. My laptop flashed across the room, the screen glowing with a new message. Confirmation required. 10 minutes until protocol escalation. The words pulsed like a countdown to something neither the storm nor this house was prepared for. Sensing an audience, Rick seized the chance to criticize me publicly. He clapped again, telling the room I liked to sneak around with gadgets and that he was the one keeping everyone safe. The stares that swung toward me were a mixture of confusion and suspicion. I gripped the counter to keep my hands from shaking. Across the room, Nolan met my eyes and tilted his head in the slightest nod, one practiced by people who understood time-sensitive crises. It meant I didn't have long. Then came the twist. One of the younger rescue workers opened the drawer searching for candles. He stopped cold when he saw the device. His voice cracked as he asked Rick why a military communication unit was sitting in his kitchen. Rick stumbled through an excuse about confiscating it because I didn't respect his rules. The room fell into stunned silence. I checked the clock. Less than 7 minutes remained. The power died in an instant, plunging the house into near blackness. My phone's flashlight cast a weak cone of light, and the faint blue glow from my laptop flickered like a heartbeat. Rick shouted that no one was allowed to leave the room, but the countdown on my screen left no room for obedience. I ran for the basement stairs, each step echoing like a warning. The garage air was sharp and icy, stinging my lungs. I scanned the dim space for the drawer where Rick had tossed the device. Before I could reach it, heavy footsteps pounded behind me. Rick burst through the doorway, blocking my path. Breath thick with the sour edge of whiskey, he jabbed a finger toward me, shouting that I was going to ruin everything he'd built. Outside, the storm slammed into the metal door so hard it rattled the bolts. Behind him, silhouettes filled the garage entrance. Nolan stood centered, arms at his sides. The reservist gripped a wrench. One of the elderly neighbors covered her mouth. They didn't intervene, not yet, but every eye was fixed on the confrontation. My phone buzzed violently in my pocket. Final alert. 2 minutes until system failure. I stepped forward and told Rick I needed the device. He responded with a low, shaking refusal, insisting he was the authority here. A fierce gust struck the garage door, causing it to quake. The brief sliver of light that cut through revealed the fear creeping into his expression. Then Nolan stepped forward, voice steady but cutting through the chaos with unmistakable force. Rick, you have no idea who you're stopping. Silence followed thick, electric, absolute. I placed my hand on the drawer's handle. In that breathless pause, I knew the reveal was seconds away. The garage roared with wind, the door rattling so violently it echoed in my ribs. Snow blasted through the cracks, stinging my face. But all I saw was Rick standing between me and the metal cabinet, clutching it like it proved he ruled something here. My phone buzzed with a final warning pulsing through my palm. 90 seconds until system failure. That was the moment the urgency swallowed any remaining restraint. I pulled off my heavy coat and let it drop behind me with a sharp thud. The instant the dress blues came into view, the noise in the garage died. The insignia on my shoulders caught the dim light. reflecting it straight into Rick's widening eyes. He stepped back as if distance might redraw the truth. Behind me, Nolan's heels snapped together, the sound cutting through the cold like a command. "Officer on deck!" Two reservists mirrored him immediately. Even those who didn't understand the protocol instinctively stilled, their breath suspended in the frigid air. Rick's mouth moved soundlessly before he finally managed to stammer out a question he already feared the answer to. I held his gaze and told him the simple truth. Real authority doesn't need volume. I walked past him, opened the cabinet, and retrieved the device. 60 seconds. The crowd parted without being asked, creating a silent passageway back into the house. I placed the device on the counter and began the override sequence. No one dared break the silence, not even the storm. The moment the device connected, the room fell into a hush so deep it felt like the walls were listening. I keyed in the verification codes, each sequence responding with a muted click. Outside, the storm rattled the windows, counting down with me. 30 seconds. I sent the override, bypassing the cascading failsafe before it triggered a regional shutdown. The network map brightened across the laptop screen, sections of the grid flickering from unstable to steady green. One by one, every critical point held firm. The reaction mode stopped. The threat dissolved. Relief swept through the room in one unified breath. Across from me, Rick stood motionless, pressed into the corner like he was trying to disappear into the drywall. His fists were clenched, but there was no strength left in them. A rescue worker stared at him as if seeing him clearly for the first time and asked if he had any idea what kind of federal offense he'd just committed by confiscating that device. The question hung in the air like a sentence. Neighbors traded whispers. Someone muttered that I'd just kept the entire town from going dark. Rick tried to respond, mumbled something about maintaining order, but the words collapsed under the weight of the truth. No one acknowledged him. It was as though the authority he'd clung to had evaporated the moment my uniform came into view. My mother stood near the stove, hands trembling as she watched everything unfold. When I completed the final sequence and stepped back from the counter, she whispered a question about how long I'd carried all of this alone. I didn't answer. The room itself had already spoken for me. Nolan stepped toward Rick, not threatening, but immovable. His voice was calm, almost compassionate. Yet it cut straight through the last of Rick's defenses as he told him he had never controlled this house, that shouting wasn't leadership, and that I had been trained to protect even those who misunderstood me. Rick had nothing left to say. A man from the radio station leaned in and murmured that word of this would spread quickly. I told him I didn't need the attention, but we both knew it was already too late. When I closed the laptop, the silence that followed felt like judgment settling into every corner of the room. 3 days after everything unraveled, the storm finally released its hold on the town. The sky softened into a pale blue, and sunlight glinted off the thick blanket of snow that covered the road like a clean slate. When the military SUV pulled into the driveway, its tires crunching through the ice, I felt the familiar pull of duty settling back into place. Jenkins stepped out, his posture crisp despite the cold, and gave me a respectful nod. "Ready to return to base, ma'am?" Before I could step toward the vehicle, my mother wrapped her arms around me. There was a quiver in her breath, the kind that comes from someone waking from a long, heavy sleep. She told me I had shown her what real strength looked like, and that she was done allowing anyone to make rules for her under the guise of love, for the first time since I had arrived. She didn't glance over her shoulder for approval. She didn't shrink. She stood on her own. Rick lingered near the porch, a hollow version of the man who once filled every room with his voice. His eyes were rimmed red, his shoulders slumped, and no one stood beside him, no neighbors offering comfort, no authority left to cling to. He whispered something about not understanding. All I said in return was that he never had. And it wasn't anger, it was simply the truth. I climbed into the SUV, and the door shut with a solid, final snap. As Jenkins pulled away, the frozen landscape stretched out wide and unbroken. I exhaled slowly, letting the weight of the last few days dissolve into the cold air. Driving away, I knew one thing with absolute clarity. He never ran that house, only the people too afraid to stand up. And it had taken just one moment to reset everything into its rightful place.